The city of Harlem never really sleeps, it only changes rhythm. On warm summer nights in the early 1980s, the streets seemed alive with sound, the hum of traffic, the murmur of conversations, the low pulse of a distant radio playing Marvin Gaye. Streetlights shimmered off puddles left by the evening rain, turning the cracked sidewalks into mirrors for the neon glow. It was here, beneath those lights, that legends were born and forgotten. Among them stood a man named Azie Faison, a name whispered with respect, fear, and an almost mythical curiosity. At first glance, Azie didn't fit the image of a street king. He wasn't loud, he wasn't violent, his voice carried the kind of calm that made people listen. But behind that calm was calculation, and behind calculation, survival. Harlem in those years wasn't a place that forgave weakness. Every block had its own rules, every corner its own hierarchy. To make it there, you had to be more than tough, you had to be patient, watchful, and just dangerous enough to keep the wolves away. The 1980s were changing everything. Disco was dying, hip-hop was being born, and the new currency of power wasn't gold or reputation, it was crack cocaine. It spread through the neighborhoods like wildfire, consuming lives and building empires overnight. Those who could control it became something close to royalty. Yet for every crown, there was a curse waiting. And at the center of that contradiction stood Azie, a young man with ambition burning hotter than the city lights. The story begins not with chaos, but with quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Imagine a small apartment window overlooking the Harlem streets, the sound of sirens in the distance, and a young Azie staring out, lost in thought. He doesn't know it yet, but his name will one day travel far beyond these blocks. For now, he's just another dreamer, hungry, clever, and already learning that the game of life in the city is played with no referees. Azie's life would later become the stuff of urban folklore. People would tell his story in barbershops and basements, in classrooms and corner stores. Some would call him a hero who outsmarted the system, others, a cautionary tale of what happens when the game takes more than it gives. The truth, as it usually is, lies somewhere in between. He wasn't born into crime. He was born into struggle, and from struggle came choices, some good, some unforgivable. At night, Harlem looked almost peaceful from afar. The skyline shimmered under the city haze, taxis drifted by like glowing beetles, and for a moment you could believe in the illusion of safety. But down on the streets, the rhythm was different, a restless energy pulsed through every exchange of cash, every handshake that could mean a deal or a death sentence. Azie walked through it like a man both part of it and apart from it, always observing, always calculating. There's something hypnotic about stories like his, they unfold slowly, luring you in with glamour before revealing the cost. Azie didn't chase danger for thrill, he chased control, the ability to shape his own fate. Yet fate, as it turned out, had plans of its own. Beneath the glitter of Harlem's nightlife was an undercurrent of despair, families torn apart by addiction, children learning the wrong lessons from the right people. The same empire that fed Azie's dreams would soon consume the community he loved. For now, though, we linger in the early days, the calm period before he makes his first real move. The air feels heavy with possibility. On the street corner, someone sells mixtapes, another hustles fake jewelry, and Azie watches them all. He studies people, their patterns, their mistakes, their desires. He notices that the loudest men rarely last long. Power, he learns, is quiet, it moves in whispers, not shouts. The narrator's voice softens as the city hums around him. You can almost hear the rattle of the subway under the pavement, smell the faint mix of fried food and gasoline. Somewhere, a radio plays Juicy Fruit, its melody rising through an open window. Harlem breathes like a living thing, a heartbeat of ambition and exhaustion intertwined. Azie would later call those early years the time of learning. Before the millions, before the betrayals, there was simply observation. He saw how money could change people, how greed turned partners into enemies, how even loyalty came with an expiration date. But back then, he was still idealistic, still dreaming of success that didn't require blood or loss. He imagined using his mind, not his fists, to make his way out. But dreams, like smoke, don't stay contained for long. Harlem had a way of finding every weakness, every hunger, and turning it into business. When opportunity knocked, it rarely looked like salvation, it looked like risk dressed in luxury. Azie's first step into that world would seem small, a favor, a transaction, a handshake, but it would be the beginning of everything. There's a strange serenity in remembering stories like this at night. Maybe because time has dulled the edges. The violence is a memory now, softened by distance. The young man who once ruled corners now speaks to schools, warning others not to repeat his mistakes. But to understand how he got there, how he became both legend and ghost, we have to start here, in the quiet before it all began. So picture it again, Harlem, 1983. The smell of rain on hot asphalt. The hum of fluorescent signs outside small clubs. A young Azie Faison walking home, head down, mind racing. Around him, the city glows with both danger and promise. He doesn't yet know that his name will one day be written in rap lyrics, retold in films, and studied as a symbol of the American street dream gone wrong. For now, he just wants more comfort, more control, more meaning. As the night deepens, the narrator's tone softens further, inviting rest. The city sounds fade to a distant echo. The story of Azie Faison is not one of sudden violence, but of slow transformation, a young man learning how ambition can become a prison and how freedom sometimes hides behind the illusion of power. And somewhere in that darkness, under the hum of Harlem's streetlights, destiny waits, silent, patient, inevitable. Before there was the empire, before the whispers of money and power, there was a boy named Azie, just another face among thousands trying to find meaning in the concrete jungle. Born in the Bronx in 1964, his early world was small but intense. Life wasn't gentle with his family. The Faison household lived in one of those old apartment buildings where the paint peeled from the walls and the sound of neighbors arguing seeped through thin plaster. Poverty was not an occasional visitor, it was a constant resident. And yet, even then, young Azie carried something rare, an alertness, a sense that he was meant for more than just survival. His childhood was marked by tragedy that would carve deep lines in his memory. When he was just 6 years old, his family's apartment caught fire. The blaze tore through their home in the middle of the night, turning everything familiar into smoke and panic. The smell of burning wood, the sound of his mother's screams, the sight of neighbors helping each other down stairwells, these became imprinted in his young mind. They escaped with their lives, but not with much else. The family had to start over, displaced, homeless for a while, carrying only what they could remember. For Azie, that night became the first moment he truly understood loss. It wasn't about possessions, it was about how fragile everything could be. The Bronx of the 1970s was a place in transition, decaying buildings, rising crime, and streets filled with both music and desperation. Yet amid that chaos, there was also community. People looked out for one another because they had to. Azie's mother worked tirelessly to keep food on the table, often juggling multiple jobs. His father wasn't always around, which forced young Azie to grow up faster than most boys his age. He became the man of the house before he was even a teenager, learning early that in their world, protection and responsibility came hand in hand. As he got older, the family moved to Harlem, a neighborhood with its own pulse, its own legend. Harlem in the late 70s was alive with culture and contradictions. You could hear gospel from one corner, jazz from another, and the emerging sounds of hip-hop echoing from parks where kids turned turntables into instruments of rebellion. On the same block, you'd see children playing double dutch beside dealers exchanging handshakes. It was beauty and danger coexisting under the same skyline. For a boy like Azie, Harlem was both a classroom and a test. He watched how people moved, the hustlers in expensive coats, the businessmen in pressed suits, the mothers with tired eyes walking their kids home from school. He admired the sharpness of those who seemed to control their environment. They had confidence, presence, power. To a boy who had once lost everything in a fire, that kind of control looked like safety. He didn't dream of being feared or famous, he dreamed of never feeling helpless again. He wasn't a troublemaker, not yet. Teachers often described him as quiet but observant, intelligent but distracted. He saw through things too quickly, the lies, the systems, the hypocrisy. He knew the odds were stacked, that a boy from his neighborhood wasn't supposed to dream too big. Still, there was a spark in him that refused to dim. He wanted to help his mother, to bring her peace after years of struggle. But in Harlem, the road to peace was rarely straight. The streets had their own education, one not taught in schools. There, respect was earned through courage, reputation, and, eventually, money. It wasn't long before Azie began noticing how the older guys on the block moved differently. They seemed untouchable, driving new cars, wearing gold chains that caught the sunlight. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving in a world that had forgotten about everyone else. To Azie, they represented power and escape, a way to rewrite his story. He started working small jobs, doing whatever he could to help his family. Sometimes it was legitimate, running errands, sweeping floors, stocking shelves. But even as he worked, he could feel the pull of something bigger. Every block, every corner whispered opportunity, even if it came with danger. The line between right and wrong blurred when survival was on the line. And Harlem, always humming, seemed to test everyone's limits. At night, he'd walk home beneath the yellow glow of streetlights, watching the city breathe around him. The laughter of teenagers, the hiss of a passing bus, the faint music drifting from a club down the block, all of it wrapped around him like a strange lullaby. Sometimes, he'd imagine himself years from now, no longer struggling, finally able to provide. But he also sensed that whatever path would get him there wouldn't come without sacrifice. Those early years were shaping something inside him, resilience, intuition, and an almost quiet defiance. Azie wasn't reckless, he was thoughtful. Even as a teenager, he understood the importance of timing. He'd see others rush into the game, make quick money, and vanish just as fast. He told himself that if he ever stepped into that world, he'd do it differently. Smarter. Cleaner. More controlled. Still, for all his intelligence and self-discipline, Azie couldn't ignore the feeling of limitation. Harlem was filled with dreamers who never left. He saw talent everywhere, singers, dancers, hustlers, yet most of them burned out before they ever broke through. It wasn't because they lacked ambition, but because the environment swallowed ambition whole. Opportunity was scarce, and when something promised a shortcut, it became irresistible. The 1970s faded into the 1980s, and the city's heartbeat began to change. The economy was rough, unemployment high, and temptation was at every corner. 4. Young men like Azie, the system offered few ways out, no safety nets, no second chances. But the streets? They always had openings. They recruited silently, pulling in those who wanted something more. There's a tenderness in remembering him at this stage, a young man not yet hardened, still capable of dreaming clean dreams. He wasn't the drug kingpin yet. He wasn't the millionaire or the survivor of gunfire. He was just a boy who had seen too much too soon, walking the line between innocence and inevitability. The nights in Harlem carried their own wisdom. As Azie looked out from his apartment window, he saw a world both cruel and captivating. Somewhere deep down, he knew that one day he'd have to choose, to either be consumed by that world or to master it. The fire that had once taken his home had left a deeper flame inside him, a hunger to never be powerless again. And so, with the quiet patience that would one day make him famous, Azie Faison began watching, learning, and preparing. The streets were about to offer him his first real chance. It would start small, almost innocently, but it would lead to a life far bigger, and far darker, than anything he could have imagined. For now, though, the story rests here, in that fragile space between youth and destiny. The boy who lost everything was about to step into a world where he could have anything, except peace. Harlem, by the dawn of the 1980s, was a city caught between dreams and decay. On the surface, it shimmered with color, gospel choirs still filled the churches, block parties echoed with laughter, and corner stores buzzed with gossip. But beneath that rhythm lay an undercurrent of desperation. Jobs were scarce, hope was thinning, and an invisible new force was spreading quietly through the neighborhoods, a white powder that promised both escape and destruction. Azie Faison was a young man standing on the edge of this transformation. He was barely out of his teens, restless, intelligent, and tired of watching his mother struggle. The streets had been whispering to him for years, and now their call was getting louder. Around him, he saw people his age driving expensive cars, wearing jewelry that caught the sun, and moving with a kind of confidence he'd never seen in anyone who worked a regular job. They weren't college graduates or businessmen, they were hustlers. And in Harlem, that meant power. He didn't dive in head first, he watched first. Observation was his strength. Azie learned early that survival in the streets wasn't about being the loudest or the boldest, it was about timing. He started by hanging around the corners where deals happened, quietly studying the flow. He noticed the lookouts, the boys who stood at the edges, pretending to talk but scanning for police. He watched the hand-to-hand exchanges that lasted no more than a few seconds. He studied how the older hustlers kept their cool, never breaking rhythm, even when tension hung thick in the air. At first, it wasn't the drugs themselves that interested him, it was the structure. The order within chaos. The way a few people could create a network that made more money in a week than most made in a year. To a young man who'd grown up seeing bills pile up and food run short, that kind of control looked like salvation. But Harlem's temptation came with rules. To survive, you had to understand the rhythm, when to speak, when to stay silent, and most importantly, who to trust. Azie wasn't reckless. He didn't start selling right away. He spent months just learning, who supplied whom, which corners were safe, which cops could be avoided, and how one wrong move could erase everything. It started small. A friend, older and already in the game, offered him a chance to make quick money, a small package to deliver, a cut of the profit. It sounded simple, almost harmless. That first deal didn't feel like crime, it felt like opportunity. He walked home that night with more cash in his pocket than he'd ever held before. The weight of it was strange, thrilling and dangerous at the same time. From that moment, the city began to look different. Every streetlight, every siren, every shadow took on new meaning. He started to understand what older hustlers meant when they said the streets talked. They didn't mean voices, they meant energy. The pulse of Harlem was alive, and once you tuned into it, it never left you. Still, Azie carried a kind of quiet dignity. He wasn't trying to be a gangster, he was trying to be somebody. The irony, of course, was that in Harlem, those two things often meant the same thing. To earn respect, you needed results. To keep results, you needed to be feared. But Azie had no interest in being feared, not yet. He wanted to be respected for his mind, for his control. That was the difference between him and most of the other young men chasing quick money. The streets in those days were changing faster than anyone realized. The crack epidemic was just beginning, and the demand was unlike anything Harlem had ever seen. Dealers who had once made modest money suddenly found themselves running miniature empires. It was intoxicating, and terrifying. Violence became common, loyalty rare. But in that chaos, Azie saw opportunity, not to dominate, but to organize. He started building connections quietly. A friend here, a supplier there, always keeping his circle small and trustworthy. He learned how to move product efficiently, how to manage risk, and how to read people, the most important skill of all. Every customer, every rival, every cop had a pattern. Azie learned them like a chess player studies moves, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Evenings became his classroom. While others partied or bragged, he sat and thought. He'd walk through the neighborhood, observing the flow of money, the way addicts begged or bargained, the way fear controlled people more than bullets ever could. In those silent moments, Azie began to craft his own vision, not to just sell, but to build something lasting, something disciplined. Yet, beneath his calm, there was still humanity. He still laughed with friends, still helped his mother with groceries, still carried the fire scars of his past quietly inside. The duality was growing, one part of him longing for stability, the other being drawn into a world where stability was impossible. It's easy to imagine him now, leaning against a brick wall on 145th Street, the city moving around him like a slow-motion film. The air heavy with the scent of fried food and exhaust, the sound of sneakers scraping pavement, the rhythm of dice games in alleyways. His expression is thoughtful, not the wild arrogance of a street kid, but the calm of someone taking it all in. In those early months, he made mistakes, small ones, the kind that didn't cost lives but taught lessons. A few bad deals, a few close calls with the police, a few moments when trust almost got him hurt. Each one hardened him a little more, sharpened his instincts. Harlem wasn't kind to the naive, and Azie learned quickly that mercy was a luxury few could afford. But unlike many who rose fast and burned out even faster, Azie moved carefully. He never let greed blind him. He studied numbers, kept records in his mind, and treated every transaction like business, not hustle. That mindset would become the foundation of his empire later on. The calm tone of his story carries a subtle tension now, like a tide rising beneath still water. Azie was changing. The boy who once dreamed of helping his family was becoming a man who understood power. And power, in Harlem, came at a price that few could truly afford. By the time he turned 20, the whispers had started. People on the block began to notice him, the young one who didn't talk much but always seemed to know what was happening. He wasn't the biggest, wasn't the most feared, but somehow, people respected him. That respect was currency, and soon, it would draw the attention of two men who would change his life forever, Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez. But for now, the story pauses here, in the dim light of Harlem's awakening, with a young Azie standing at the crossroads between innocence and infamy. The temptation of easy money had taken root, and the next step he took would define not just his future, but the destiny of an entire generation of hustlers who saw in him a reflection of their own ambition. The game had begun. Learning the game wasn't about speed. It was about patience, observation, and respect for an invisible code that ruled Harlem's underworld. Azie Faison understood that early. The streets weren't a playground, they were a chessboard, and the people who treated it like checkers didn't last long. He didn't rush to be a boss, he learned what it meant to survive among wolves before he ever thought about leading a pack. In those early days, he was the quiet student of the block. While others flashed their money, trying to prove they belonged, Azie stayed in the background. He watched every detail, who controlled which corner, who had police connections, who could be trusted, and who was all talk. Harlem's hierarchy was invisible to outsiders, but for those who paid attention, it was as structured as any corporation. The problem was, promotions came not from loyalty or merit, but from risk, the kind that could cost your life. He began as a runner, nothing more. Carrying small packages, delivering messages, and keeping his mouth shut. It wasn't glamorous work, but it taught him discipline. The older hustlers noticed his focus, the way he moved quietly, the way he never bragged. In a world full of noise, that kind of silence made people curious. Soon, he wasn't just a messenger, he was being trusted with more. To understand Harlem's drug trade in those years, you had to understand its rhythm. It wasn't chaos, not to those inside it. Deals happened like choreography, each motion carefully timed. The lookouts, the stash spots, the signals, it all operated like a living machine. Azie studied it the way a musician studies melody. He learned when to move fast, when to wait, when to blend into the background. The city had its own pulse, and he was learning how to sync his heartbeat to it. But even as he rose through the ranks, Azie kept his head clear. He saw how easy it was to get lost, how greed could make a man reckless, how one bad decision could turn a good week into a death sentence. Harlem was full of ghosts who had flown too close to the light. They were remembered in whispers, their photos fading in old apartments, their names carved into the cautionary tales of the next generation. Azie didn't want to be a ghost. He wanted to be a story that ended differently. At night, when the block quieted down, he often walked alone. The city light stretched long across the pavement, and the hum of passing cars felt almost hypnotic. He'd think about the choices he was making, whether he was crossing a line he could never uncross. But then morning would come, and the same hunger would return. The same drive to make something of himself. For a young man who had nothing, the streets offered both purpose and poison, and it was hard to tell them apart. He learned from older hustlers, men who carried themselves like businessmen, not gangsters. They taught him that image mattered, that confidence was currency. If you looked calm, people believed you were in control. If you stayed consistent, they'd follow you. Money don't make the man, one mentor told him, discipline does. It was advice that stuck. Azie began to shape himself not as a dealer, but as a thinker. Every move he made had intention behind it. Every connection, every investment, every word spoken was part of a larger plan. He kept a small crew, not out of distrust, but strategy. Big crews drew attention. Small ones survived. His circle was made up of people who understood his vision: make money fast, but make it smart. No unnecessary violence, no chaos, no headlines. The goal wasn't fame, it was longevity. That mindset separated him from most others his age. While they celebrated quick riches, Azie was already thinking about structure, about systems. The city around him was changing fast. The crack epidemic had begun to spread like wildfire, and dealers who once made modest living now found themselves sitting on fortunes. Streets that had once been filled with corner hustlers were turning into battlegrounds. Guns replaced fists, and paranoia replaced pride. Azie watched all of it, quietly adapting. He knew that to survive, he'd have to evolve faster than the chaos. There were moments of fear, of course. Police raids, street robberies, friends getting caught or disappearing. The game was cruelly efficient, it removed the careless and rewarded the careful, until even the careful ran out of luck. But Azie seemed untouchable for a while. Not because he was invincible, but because he understood balance. He never stayed in one place too long. He never got too comfortable. He learned how to talk to people, to calm angry clients, to negotiate with competitors, to defuse situations before they exploded. In an environment built on aggression, his calm became his weapon. People trusted him because he didn't raise his voice. He handled pressure like it was routine. Even when things went wrong, and they often did, he never panicked. That quiet confidence became his signature. One night, standing beneath a flickering streetlight, an older hustler told him, "The street's got two kinds of people, the loud ones and the ones you never see coming. Be the second." Azie smiled, because he already was. His rise wasn't about spectacle, it was about strategy. He moved differently, thought differently, and most importantly, listened differently. There was an art to surviving Harlem in the 1980s. You had to read the energy of every room, sense betrayal before it arrived, and keep one foot out the door at all times. Azie learned that the game didn't love anyone, it tolerated you as long as you served it. The moment you got careless, it devoured you. And yet, even with all his awareness, he couldn't see what was coming. He couldn't know that the very discipline that set him apart would attract two other rising stars, men whose paths would intertwine with his in ways that would define an era. For now, though, he was still learning, still perfecting his craft. The nights grew longer, the profits grew larger, and the danger crept closer. He was no longer just a boy running errands, he was becoming something else, something Harlem hadn't seen before, a businessman built from the streets, with the cold precision of a strategist and the charm of a diplomat. The city, in its strange way, respected him. The dealers nodded when he passed. The elders whispered his name as a young man to watch. Even the police knew the rumor, that there was a quiet one out there, a thinker, someone who ran his operation like a boardroom instead of a battlefield. But Harlem has a way of testing even its brightest minds. The same intelligence that lifted Azie up would soon pull him into alliances that would change everything, alliances built not on friendship, but on ambition. Because in the world of hustlers, every lesson comes with a price. And Azie was about to pay his first one. Every empire begins with an alliance. In Harlem's shadowy underworld, loyalty was currency, and trust was as rare as peace. For Azie Faison, the next chapter of his life would be defined by two names that carried both promise and prophecy, Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez. Together, they would form a brotherhood that seemed unstoppable. But like all stories born in the streets, their bond would shine brightest right before it burned. Azie had already earned a quiet reputation as someone who could move smart. He wasn't flashy, but people noticed the precision in his work, the consistency, the calm. Word spread through Harlem that he was different, disciplined, level-headed, and uninterested in unnecessary drama. In a world addicted to attention, that made him magnetic. It was only a matter of time before the other rising stars found their way into his orbit. Rich Porter was the first. To Harlem, Rich was more than a hustler, he was a symbol of charisma and success. He dressed sharp, spoke with confidence, and had a natural gift for making people feel like they belonged. Where Azie was quiet, Rich was vibrant. He could walk into any room and command attention without trying. The two met through mutual friends, each sizing the other up with the silent understanding that they were both chasing something bigger than the street corner hustle. Their connection was instant but cautious. Azie saw in Rich someone with unmatched charm, a man who understood people the way Azie understood structure. Together, they could balance each other out. And for Rich, Azie's composure offered stability. "We could really do something," Rich told him one night, his voice low but steady. "Not just get money. Build something." Not long after came Alpo Martinez, younger, louder, and far more unpredictable. Alpo had energy that filled every space he entered. He was fast-talking, fearless, and reckless in a way that could either make him unstoppable or destroy him completely. He had ambition that bordered on danger, but underneath it was raw intelligence. Azie saw potential in him, the spark of someone who could go far if only he learned control. The three were an unlikely trio, Azie, the thinker, Rich, the charmer, and Alpo, the firebrand. Their chemistry was undeniable. Each brought something the others lacked. Azie's methodical mind gave their operation structure, Rich's smooth-talking opened doors and created networks, Alpo's boldness made them fearless in pursuit of expansion. They didn't just want to sell, they wanted to redefine how the game was played. At first, it was all synergy and promise. They began small, pooling resources, sharing connections, moving product with a precision Harlem hadn't seen before. Azie introduced a sense of organization, almost corporate in its design. There were ranks, responsibilities, systems. Everyone had a role, and everyone knew who they answered to. It wasn't chaos, it was business. Harlem, always hungry for legends, started whispering their names together. The trio moved with confidence, not arrogance. They didn't shout their success, they wore it like armor. The corners they controlled began running smoother, cleaner. Even the older hustlers took notice. There was something different about these three, they weren't trying to be gangsters, they were trying to be kings. Their unity created something rare, stability. For a brief moment, Harlem felt organized. Violence dipped in the areas they operated because Azie demanded discipline. He believed chaos attracted cops, and cops killed profits. "The less noise we make," he'd say, "the longer we last." His approach worked, for a while. The nights in those days had a strange kind of magic. The city buzzed with energy, the music, the cars, the fashion, all reflecting a culture bursting with both pride and pain. You could walk down 145th Street and feel the pulse of something electric. In that atmosphere, Azie, Rich, and Alpo became the faces of a new Harlem dream. They were young, successful, and untouchable. Or so it seemed. Their friendship wasn't without tension, though. Azie, ever the planner, believed in patience, slow growth, calculated risk. Alpo, on the other hand, believed in speed, expansion, domination, and fearlessness. Rich often found himself in the middle, trying to keep balance between the two forces. He admired Azie's discipline but couldn't resist Alpo's energy. The trio's strength came from their differences, but so would their undoing. For now, though, the success was intoxicating. Money flowed faster than they could count it. Every night felt like proof that they had beaten the system that once oppressed them. Azie found himself buying things he never imagined: nice clothes for his mother, a new car, a better apartment. But even as his world expanded, a quiet part of him remained uneasy. He knew success in Harlem came with expiration dates. Still, it was hard not to enjoy the ride. The trio's operations ran like clockwork. Their connections extended beyond Harlem, into Washington Heights, into the Bronx, even further uptown. They built trust through reliability, not intimidation. If you worked with Azie's crew, you got paid, and you got protected. That kind of reputation traveled fast. What set them apart most wasn't just money, it was image. They became local celebrities without meaning to. Kids looked up to them, mimicking their fashion, copying their slang, even trying to walk like them. In the eyes of Harlem's youth, they weren't criminals, they were success stories. Men who rose from nothing, using the only system available to them. But beneath that glossy surface, small cracks were forming. Alpo's hunger for fame and recognition began to clash with Azie's preference for anonymity. Rich, ever loyal, tried to keep peace, but tension simmered under every meeting, every plan. Alpo wanted to be seen, to be known, to be the name people feared. Azie wanted longevity, legacy without the spotlight. There were moments when Azie would look at them both and feel the quiet dread of foresight. He could sense how easily everything could fall apart, how ego could turn brothers into enemies. Yet, for the moment, ambition held them together. The dream was still alive, and the city still believed in them. It's easy now, years later, to look back and see the inevitability. But back then, under the warm Harlem streetlights, it felt eternal. They were brothers, bound by loyalty, ambition, and shared pain. They laughed together, ate together, moved together. Every night felt like victory, another step away from poverty, another sign that they had made it. The trio's names began circulating like myths, not in newspapers, but in barbershops, pool halls, and whispered conversations. Everyone knew someone who knew them. Their legend grew, not because of violence, but because of their unity. That unity was their power. And in the streets, power always attracts danger. Azie once said in an interview years later, "We were young kings who thought the game could be controlled. But the game doesn't bow to anyone. It just waits." And waiting, somewhere in the dark, was the test that would turn this alliance into tragedy. The kind of test that no amount of money, intelligence, or loyalty could prevent. But in that moment, before betrayal, before bullets, before loss, Azie, Rich, and Alpo stood at the height of possibility. 3 men, 1 vision, and a city that watched in awe. Harlem belonged to them. And they believed, perhaps foolishly, that it always would. The rise of Azie Faison's empire didn't come with explosions or fanfare, it came quietly, like the slow build of a storm over Harlem's skyline. One corner at a time, one deal at a time, his operation began to grow into something the city hadn't seen before. It wasn't just street-level hustle anymore, it was structure, order, and scale. The young man who once carried small packages now moved entire networks. Harlem was his blueprint, and he was designing a machine that seemed unstoppable. The year was 1984, and the streets were changing faster than anyone could process. Crack cocaine had exploded into the market, cheap, addictive, and devastating. It spread through neighborhoods like wildfire, turning addicts into customers, and customers into currency. Azie, Rich, and Alpo found themselves standing at the center of this new economy, not as small players but as architects. Their operation, disciplined and efficient, quickly outgrew its local rivals. Azie's approach was unlike anything Harlem had seen. He didn't treat the game like a gamble, he treated it like business. There were shifts, territories, and quotas. He trained his workers like employees, paid them on time, and demanded professionalism. Violence wasn't encouraged, it was bad for business. If there was a problem, he solved it with calm negotiation before bullets ever flew. He even created an internal rule: no one sells to children, no one disrespects the neighborhood. In a strange, twisted way, it was a code of ethics within chaos. Rich Porter handled image and morale. He was the public face, charming, generous, and beloved. People trusted him, and that trust kept customers loyal. Alpo, meanwhile, managed distribution. He moved product quickly and fearlessly, taking risks Azie would never take, often expanding faster than anyone thought possible. The combination was lethal: intellect, charisma, and audacity bound together under one empire. Money began to pour in at a rate that seemed unreal. Every night, the trio counted stacks of cash that barely fit into bags. Cars, jewelry, designer clothes, it all followed naturally. But the difference was that Azie saw wealth not as decoration, but as leverage. He invested. He saved. He planned. While others flaunted their success, he stayed low-key, spending only when necessary. His focus wasn't on looking rich, it was on staying rich. The people around him began to notice the change. His name carried weight now, even among older dealers who had ruled before him. Harlem's young hustlers began to whisper his methods like lessons. Azie don't play wild, they'd say. He plays smart. The myth of his calm started spreading, a kind of respect reserved for those who built quietly. He even began implementing an idea that would become infamous in Harlem's lore: the dry cleaner system. Instead of handing product directly to customers, Azie created levels of separation, small cells of sellers who only knew their immediate contacts, never the full operation. It was a safeguard against betrayal, and it made his empire nearly invisible to police. The efficiency was staggering. At its height, some said he made more in a week than many made in a lifetime. But with every new dollar came new danger. Wealth draws attention, and in Harlem, attention could get you killed. The streets began to murmur. Rivals grew jealous, police grew curious, and outsiders wanted in. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about control. The trio had built something that threatened the old order, and in a city where power was currency, disruption always came with consequences. Still, Azie believed he could manage it. His faith was in systems, not superstition. He thought that as long as the operation ran cleanly, it would stay protected. What he didn't yet understand was that the streets weren't logical. They didn't reward balance, they demanded chaos. At night, when the world quieted, Azie sometimes sat alone counting cash under the soft hum of fluorescent light. The rhythm of bills stacking on the table became a kind of meditation. But behind his composure was a growing unease, a feeling that something about the scale of it all was unnatural. There were too many moving parts, too many people depending on his calm. The empire was growing faster than his control. Meanwhile, Harlem was transforming around them. Addiction was spreading like a plague. Once lively blocks were becoming ghost towns filled with vacant faces and desperate souls. Mothers cried for sons who disappeared into smoke. The same trade that made Azie powerful was devouring the neighborhood he grew up in. It was a truth he tried not to look at directly, because looking meant admitting guilt. Rich, ever the optimist, brushed it off. "We didn't start this," he'd say, lighting a cigar. "We just learned how to play the hand we were dealt." Alpo, on the other hand, saw no reason to slow down. "The city's ours," he'd grin, "and it's just getting started." Azie would nod quietly, but his silence wasn't agreement, it was reflection. Deep down, he was beginning to wonder what the end of all this would look like. There were nights when he couldn't sleep. He'd stare at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside, sirens, laughter, and the occasional gunshot echoing from blocks away. He thought about his mother, about the fire that had taken their home, about the promises he'd made to never live in fear again. And yet, here he was, richer than ever, but more cautious than ever before. The more he built, the more he realized how fragile it all was. Still, he couldn't stop. The machine had momentum now. Too many people relied on it, too many families ate because of it. Stopping meant unraveling the lives of dozens who depended on him. So he pressed on, tightening his systems, perfecting his strategy, convincing himself that control would protect him. The nights blurred into mornings, and the empire stretched beyond Harlem's borders. His organization ran like clockwork, predictable, efficient, and deeply profitable. But the streets don't let perfection last long. Every system breeds its own chaos, and every empire eventually meets something it can't predict. For Azie, that moment was closer than he thought. Jealousy was growing, envy tightening around his success like a noose. The same discipline that made him great made others hate him, because he made it look easy. Years later, when asked how it felt to be at the top, Azie said softly, "It felt quiet. Too quiet. Like standing in the eye of a storm, pretending it wasn't moving." And indeed, the storm was coming. It would test everything he had built, his rules, his loyalty, his faith in order. The empire that had risen with grace and precision was about to be shaken by forces no calculation could prevent. But for now, in the glow of Harlem's streetlights, the trio's creation stood as the city's most powerful operation. Money flowed like water, loyalty seemed unbreakable, and the illusion of control still held. The machine was perfect. And perfection, in the streets, never lasts long. Wealth, when it arrives suddenly, doesn't just change your surroundings, it changes your silence. For Azie Faison, silence had always been his comfort, his weapon. But now, even quiet carried a different texture. The hum of his refrigerator, the ticking of a gold watch, the faint sound of a city still awake, everything seemed to echo success. He had gone from sleeping on floors to resting in leather chairs, from counting coins to counting thousands. And yet, even in comfort, there was a strange emptiness that money couldn't fill. Azie's Harlem empire had matured into something extraordinary. His operations ran smooth, his associates respected him, and his profits exceeded imagination. But the more he achieved, the more he found himself watching the world instead of celebrating it. From the window of his apartment, he'd see kids playing in the street, kids who once reminded him of himself, and realize how far he had drifted from the boy who dreamed of helping his mother. The world around him shimmered with excess. Harlem had become a theater of fashion and wealth. Satin jackets, gold ropes, and fur coats glistened beneath neon lights. Expensive cars lined the curbs outside nightclubs, and laughter drifted into the air thick with cigarette smoke and ambition. To outsiders, Azie and his partners were the picture of success, young black millionaires who had beaten the odds. But inside, there was a slow, almost invisible unraveling. He bought his mother a home, a small brick house on a quiet street away from the noise. It was his proudest moment. When she smiled at him, he felt a flicker of peace. He told himself that everything he did, every risk, every late night, was for her comfort. But as he looked around the new house, the furniture, the gifts, the luxury, he couldn't ignore the unease creeping in. The more he gave, the less grounded he felt. His nights grew longer. The money was good, but it came with weight. He was now responsible for dozens of people, runners, distributors, enforcers, couriers. They all depended on his stability. If he made one bad call, it wasn't just his empire that would crumble, it was their lives too. That kind of pressure doesn't announce itself, it seeps in, slowly, wearing down even the calmest mind. Rich Porter, on the other hand, thrived in the spotlight. He loved the attention, the rhythm of nightlife, the laughter that came from being recognized. Alpo fed off that energy too. He was the loud one, the risk-taker, the spark in every room. Together, they made a striking trio, the businessman, the charmer, the daredevil. But beneath the surface, their differences were beginning to take root. Azie started spending more time alone. He didn't crave the noise anymore. The nights at clubs, the music, the champagne, it all felt hollow. He'd sit in his car with the engine running, staring out at Harlem's lights, wondering how something so bright could cast such dark shadows. Around him, violence was rising again. Rival crews were forming, desperation was spreading, and the same drug that made him powerful was tearing families apart. The paradox was impossible to ignore. The empire that had lifted him up was destroying the world that made him. Every new car parked on his block came with an unspoken price, more danger, more jealousy, more eyes watching from the dark. Harlem was no longer just alive, it was restless. But for all his introspection, Azie couldn't walk away. Not yet. There was too much at stake. Too much invested. He kept telling himself it was temporary, that one day he'd leave, maybe open a business, maybe do something legitimate. But the streets don't let go that easily. Once you've built an empire from dust, it clings to you. There were moments when it all still felt good. When he and Rich would drive through the city late at night, music low, windows down, talking about the future. "We're gonna flip it," Rich would say, eyes gleaming. "One day we won't have to touch the streets no more." Azie would nod, though deep down, he doubted it. The game didn't reward exits, it punished them. One evening, he hosted a quiet gathering at his apartment. A few trusted friends, soft jazz playing, good food on the table. For a few hours, it felt normal, like family. People laughed, shared stories, talked about dreams. But as the night wound down, Azie stepped away to the balcony. From there, he could see the glow of Harlem stretching endlessly into the night. It was beautiful, but it was also heavy. He knew too many people beneath those lights who were suffering, mothers crying, sons lost, homes broken. And in a small way, he knew his empire had contributed to it. He closed his eyes and tried to silence the guilt. "It's just the way the world works," he whispered to himself. "Somebody's always paying the price." Still, there were small flashes of joy. He was respected. He was feared. People greeted him with reverence, their tone shifting when they said his name. In the world he'd chosen, that kind of recognition was power. And yet, it came with distance, the kind that separates a man from his humanity. The calm narrator's voice lingers here, reflecting the duality of Azie's success. The power was intoxicating, but it came with loneliness. He had everything he thought he wanted, the money, the security, the respect, and yet, he was restless. The nights didn't bring peace, they brought reflection. Every success reminded him of how fragile it all was. As months passed, the trio's unity began to strain. Alpo grew more impatient, pushing for expansion. He wanted to move faster, take bigger risks, chase bigger profits. Rich remained the mediator, but even his charm couldn't keep the cracks from widening. Azie felt it in every conversation, an invisible tension humming beneath their laughter. Still, on the surface, everything looked perfect. They drove expensive cars, wore custom suits, and lived lives that seemed untouchable. Harlem celebrated them as symbols of success. But perfection in the streets is an illusion. It draws envy, invites betrayal, and guarantees tragedy. Years later, when Azie looked back on that time, he described it as the peak, the part where everything looked golden, but the fall had already begun. He said the nights were the hardest to remember, not because of what happened, but because of how good it felt before everything went wrong. The empire stood tall, shimmering in its quiet efficiency. The money flowed endlessly, the loyalty seemed solid, and the future looked limitless. But beneath the gold, something darker was forming, not outside the circle, but within it. Ambition was turning into greed, friendship into rivalry, and power into paranoia. And though Azie didn't know it yet, the peace he had built was about to fracture. The empire that had given him everything was preparing to take everything back. For now, though, he sits in his apartment, lights dim, city humming below. A gold watch ticks softly on the table. The clock moves forward, unaware that time, like loyalty in Harlem, is something no man can buy forever. By the mid-1980s, Harlem was breathing heavy. The rhythm of the streets had changed, faster, louder, more dangerous. The crack era wasn't just a wave anymore, it was a flood. You could feel it in the air, taste it in the silence between sirens, and see it in the eyes of people who once smiled but now stared through you. The same neighborhoods that once moved to the sound of jazz and gospel were now moving to the tempo of survival. Azie Faison's empire stood at the heart of this transformation. What had begun as an organized, disciplined operation had grown into something vast, an invisible network that touched almost every block in Harlem. The money was surreal. Cash flowed through apartments, cars, and basements in rivers of green. At their peak, it was said they made tens of thousands in a single day. But for Azie, it wasn't just the profit that stunned him, it was the scale. The city he once studied like a map was now unrecognizable. The corners he used to walk as a boy were lined with addicts, their faces pale under the streetlights. Mothers called their children in before dark, afraid of stray bullets and strangers. The sound of laughter had been replaced by the crackle of lighters heating glass pipes. Harlem was both rich and dying, fed and starved by the same hand. At first, Azie tried to distance himself emotionally. It's business, he'd tell himself. It's just the system. But deep down, the contradiction was eating away at him. He could see the wreckage building around him, friends overdosing, families collapsing, kids skipping school to chase fast money. His empire had structure and rules, but the world around it didn't. The more successful he became, the more chaos Harlem seemed to drown in. And yet, from the outside, it looked like the golden age. The street sparkled with fresh cars, BMWs, Benzes, Lincolns, polished and parked in lines like trophies. Music thumped from every window, Run DMC, LL Cool J, and the rising voice of hip-hop telling stories born from the same streets they ruled. People dressed like kings and queens, even if they were only rich until the next arrest or robbery. For many, the streets were no longer a warning, they were the dream. The trio, Azie, Rich, and Alpo, sat at the center of this new Harlem mythology. Their influence extended beyond business. They were trendsetters, icons, even folk heroes in a twisted way. Kids mimicked their clothes, copied their slang, and bragged about spotting them on 145th Street. It was a strange kind of fame, one that came without cameras but carried the weight of legend. But legends have shadows. And Harlem was full of them. Azie began noticing the change in energy, not just in the streets, but in people's eyes. Jealousy was spreading. Competitors wanted a piece of the throne, and new crews were forming every week. Guns were everywhere. Loyalty, once sacred, was starting to feel like a rumor. He still kept his operation running smoothly, professional, quiet, efficient, but paranoia was growing like a vine through the walls. He'd check mirrors, change cars, rotate safe houses. Every handshake felt heavier, every smile a little too wide. It's not fear, he'd tell himself. It's awareness. But he knew the difference was shrinking. Even within the trio, small cracks were beginning to show. Alpo's ambition was becoming restless. He wanted more, more corners, more territory, more visibility. To him, fear was power. To Azie, fear was weakness. Rich tried to keep peace, but Harlem had a way of feeding ambition faster than reason. The energy that had once bound them now hummed with tension. At night, the city no longer felt alive, it felt haunted. The glow of streetlights illuminated faces that didn't look human anymore. Addicts wandered like ghosts, dealers stood on corners with hollow eyes, and every few blocks, someone's story ended in the sound of a gunshot. Azie watched it all, silent, the weight of success pressing down harder each day. He'd retreat sometimes to his apartment, away from the street noise, sitting by the window as the city breathed outside. He'd think about his childhood, the fire, the hunger, the dreams that pushed him to this point. He had wanted freedom, control, stability. But now, he felt like a prisoner surrounded by wealth. Money don't change what's chasing you, he'd whisper to himself. It just makes it harder to run. Even as he wrestled with doubt, the machine kept running. The money didn't stop, the phones didn't stop, the demands didn't stop. People looked to him for guidance, for structure, for protection. He had built something bigger than himself, and it was still hungry. The contrast between day and night in Harlem became almost spiritual. By day, the city looked alive, kids laughing, stores open, preachers shouting hope into the air. But at night, the streets told the truth. Dealers replaced vendors, addicts replaced customers, and police cruisers replaced taxis. Harlem became two worlds existing at once, one innocent, one cursed, and Azie lived in both. There were moments of reflection, brief flashes where he could still feel human. A child would wave at his car. An old neighbor would thank him for paying someone's rent. In those moments, he felt like maybe, somehow, he was balancing the scales. But deep down, he knew the scale was broken. You couldn't sell poison and still call it progress. You couldn't feed both hope and destruction and expect peace. The narrator's voice softens here, drawing listeners deeper into the paradox, success surrounded by ruin, wealth born from suffering. Harlem was thriving and dying at the same time, and Azie was its quiet architect. He didn't gloat, he analyzed. He didn't celebrate, he calculated. Every new day was both a victory and a warning. Rich and Alpo, meanwhile, thrived on motion. They were out in the nightlife, in the clubs, the bars, the car shows, living the kind of life that invited attention. Azie, by contrast, preferred stillness. He began to withdraw, trusting fewer people, speaking less, watching everything. His instincts, sharpened by years of surviving the streets, began to whisper again. Something was coming. He could feel it, though he couldn't name it. Harlem's energy had shifted permanently. The laughter was thinner, the music louder, the air thicker. The once vibrant community that had raised him was now sinking under the weight of addiction and betrayal. The cracks in the streets were mirrored in the cracks in his friendships. And somewhere between the glitter and the grief, Azie began to understand a truth he could no longer unsee: the game never ends well for anyone. But for now, the empire still stood. Money still flowed. The cars still gleamed. The illusion of control still held. Harlem pulsed beneath it all, unaware that the story was already tilting toward tragedy. And in that final calm before the chaos, Azie Faison, the quiet king of Harlem, sat in the center of it all, watching the city he loved turn into something he could no longer recognize. Fame in the streets is a strange kind of light, it doesn't illuminate, it exposes. For Azie Faison, that light had grown too bright. Once, he had moved in shadows, blending into Harlem's heartbeat with quiet precision. But now, everyone knew his name. Children whispered it with admiration, dealers invoked it with envy, and detectives wrote it down in notebooks. Fame, in the underworld, wasn't applause, it was surveillance. He could no longer walk down 145th Street without heads turning. The same calm face that once slipped unnoticed through crowds now carried weight, reputation, and danger. People would stop him, shake his hand, or call out his nickname with reverence. Some asked for help, some asked for opportunity, and some simply wanted to say they'd met him. The attention felt flattering at first. But the more visible he became, the more invisible his peace became. It was a paradox he couldn't escape. The more money he made, the more people knew him, and the more people knew him, the less safe he felt. Harlem had never loved anyone for long. Admiration turned to jealousy with time, and respect could twist into resentment overnight. Every compliment came with a hidden motive. Every friendly face might hide an empty hand waiting to take. Azie wasn't paranoid, he was prepared. Years of surviving the streets had taught him that visibility was a liability. He began changing his routines, driving different cars, using different routes, avoiding certain crowds. He stopped attending the big parties and gatherings that had once been symbols of power. The city felt smaller now, its corners sharper. Every sound outside his apartment window made him pause. The hum of an engine, a knock at the door, nothing felt harmless anymore. But the most dangerous part of fame wasn't the rivals or the cops. It was the silence it created around him. Real friends began to fade away. Conversations grew cautious. People didn't talk to Azie anymore, they talked at him. They wanted to impress him, not understand him. Every relationship began to feel like a transaction. Even laughter had a hollow echo. Rich Porter and Alpo, meanwhile, were living differently. They embraced the spotlight. They wore flashier clothes, drove louder cars, appeared in every room that mattered. Harlem's nightlife belonged to them, velvet ropes, champagne bottles, flashing lights. Alpo especially thrived in it. He loved the attention, the danger, the thrill of being recognized. If they don't know your name, he'd say, "You ain't doing enough." Azie didn't argue, he just watched. He knew what that kind of exposure invited. He'd seen too many young kings die because they couldn't stay unseen. The streets had rules older than anyone alive, and rule number one was simple: once they can see you, they can reach you. His unease grew deeper with each passing month. Police presence in Harlem was intensifying. Unmarked cars lurked near known corners, and whispers spread that federal investigators were taking interest in certain untouchables. Azie kept his operation running tight, but he could feel the net tightening. The illusion of control was cracking. There were close calls, raids that missed him by hours, associates who vanished without explanation. One night, while driving home, he noticed a car following him for several blocks. He didn't panic, panic got people killed, but he took note. 2 turns later, the car was still there. He slowed down, turned again, and it followed. Finally, he pulled into a crowded gas station, pretending to refuel. The car drove past. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed in a hotel under a false name, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how thin safety had become. Still, he couldn't disappear completely. His name carried too much gravity. Even when he tried to step back, people brought him back in, out of loyalty, fear, or greed. The machine he'd built was running with or without him, and shutting it down wasn't as simple as walking away. Too many lives depended on it, too many promises had been made. He found himself retreating inward, speaking less, trusting even fewer people. The once vibrant rhythm of Harlem now sounded like static, noise without harmony. He began noticing signs he'd once ignored: eyes lingering too long, conversations that stopped when he entered a room, whispers that carried his name just a little too softly. Fame had turned him into a ghost before he was dead. Even the people closest to him weren't immune to the change. He saw it in their faces, admiration laced with unease, affection mixed with obligation. Rich was still his brother, Alpo still his partner, but something unspoken had shifted. The energy between them wasn't what it used to be. They were still winning, but the joy of it was gone. Sometimes, he'd visit his mother, bringing her groceries or just sitting with her in silence. She'd smile at him, proud of his success but unaware of the danger wrapped around it. He'd listen to her talk about church, about neighbors, about the small things that still felt pure. In those moments, he almost believed he could escape, that maybe, one day, he could walk away and still keep his soul intact. But Harlem had other plans. The city that had made him was beginning to turn against him. Rivals plotted, cops watched, and friends began whispering names in exchange for leniency. The quiet was breaking. Fame had turned the once disciplined operation into a magnet for chaos. Azie couldn't control what he couldn't see. He could no longer trust what he couldn't hear. And yet, despite all the warning signs, he stayed calm. Not out of arrogance, but out of instinct. Fear clouded judgment, and judgment kept him alive. Still, late at night, lying awake, he'd find himself wondering if the streets were finally calling his debt. Every deal, every dollar, every risk, they all came with interest. And Harlem always collected. He began dreaming differently. Not of money or status, but of silence. Real silence, the kind without footsteps, without sirens, without whispers. The kind of peace he hadn't known since childhood. But in Harlem, peace was just another name for vulnerability. Azie didn't yet know it, but the danger was already on its way. The fame, the fortune, the empire, all of it had made him visible. And visibility, in his world, was the beginning of the end. For now, the story rests on that uneasy edge, a man at the peak of his power, haunted by the growing awareness that power doesn't protect, it attracts. Harlem watched him, admired him, envied him. But somewhere in that crowd of eyes, unseen and patient, were those who didn't want to praise him. They wanted to test him. And soon, they would. Night had fallen heavy over Harlem. It was one of those evenings when the air felt too still, like the city was holding its breath. Somewhere in a quiet apartment, Azie Faison sat surrounded by stacks of cash, the product of years of precision, patience, and control. The empire he built was thriving, but peace had become a luxury he couldn't afford. He was tired, not physically, but spiritually. Every success felt hollow now, every sound outside his door felt like a question. The whispers of danger had been growing louder for weeks. People were talking, about jealousy, about easy money, about betrayal. Even the streets, which once obeyed Azie's unspoken rules, now buzzed with a different energy. His name carried weight, but also expectation. Everyone wanted a piece. Some wanted guidance. Some wanted revenge. It was the night of November 10, 1987, a night that would rewrite the course of his life forever. Azie was at his apartment, a quiet place where he stored both money and trust. There were people he considered close with him, faces he'd known for years. The mood was relaxed at first, music playing low, laughter echoing faintly against the walls, talk about business and life. It was one of those Harlem nights where the world outside seemed far away. But calm in the streets was always deceptive, it was the kind that comes right before a storm. Without warning, the night changed. The door burst open. The sound, wood cracking, boots scraping, was sharp, metallic, unforgettable. In an instant, everything slowed down. Azie looked up to see masked men flooding into the room. Guns drawn. No hesitation. No demands. Just violence wrapped in silence. What happened next felt less like reality and more like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Shouts, chaos, fear. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the noise. The invaders weren't strangers, their voices carried familiarity, the kind that chills you deeper than any bullet could. They wanted money, of course. But there was something more, something personal in the way they moved, in the way they looked at him. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a betrayal. Azie tried to reason, to talk, to de-escalate. But logic had no place in that room. Then came the flash, the sound of gunfire slicing through the air like lightning. The impact hit him before he could even register pain. Then another. And another. His body jolted back, every nerve screaming. The air smelled of gunpowder, blood, and fear. He tried to speak, but his voice came out broken, almost silent. 9 shots. That's what they would count later. 9 bullets tearing through him, each one threatening to silence his story forever. The noise faded into a dull hum. The world blurred at the edges, colors melting into shadow. He could see faces above him, some panicked, some cold. Then, nothing but stillness. He didn't know how long he lay there. Minutes felt like hours, hours like eternity. Somewhere in that half-light between life and death, his mind wandered. He saw flashes, his mother's face, the fire from his childhood, Rich's laughter, Alpo's grin. The money. The power. The promises. It all played back, scene by scene, like a film at the end of the reel. And then, strangely, came peace. Not the kind he'd chased through success or discipline, but something quiet, pure silence. For the first time in years, his mind stopped racing. No deals, no phones, no plans. Just stillness. He remembered thinking, maybe this is what freedom really feels like. But life wasn't done with him yet. When the world returned, it came in fragments, bright lights, muffled voices, the smell of antiseptic. He was being lifted, moved, rushed through corridors. The weight of his own body felt foreign. Pain came next, deep, throbbing, all-consuming. Somewhere, far away, someone was shouting his name. He survived. Somehow, against every odd, Azie Faison lived. The doctors said it was a miracle. 9 gunshot wounds, and he was still breathing. But survival wasn't victory. His body was broken, his mind disoriented, and the empire he'd built, that fortress of control, had cracked overnight. The robbery had stripped him of more than money. It had stolen his illusion of safety, his faith and loyalty, and the quiet discipline he'd once prided himself on. When news spread through Harlem, it hit like thunder. Azie got hit. The words echoed from block to block. Some said he was dead. Some said he'd disappeared. For days, no one knew the truth. The city held its breath, waiting. And when the truth finally came, that he had survived, the legend grew. The man who had outsmarted the streets had now outlived them too. But for Azie, survival wasn't triumph. It was awakening. Lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines, he realized just how fragile it all was. The empire he built, the fame he gained, the loyalty he trusted, it could all vanish in seconds. He thought about the faces of those who betrayed him. He didn't need names, he knew. Betrayal in the streets doesn't surprise you, it disappoints you. It comes not from enemies, but from people who once shared your table. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, one thought returned again and again, the streets don't love you back. When he finally woke fully, under the harsh glow of hospital lights, he couldn't move much. Tubes and bandages held him together. Each breath felt like a test. But his mind, sharper than ever, began to process what had happened, not just the attack, but everything leading to it. He saw it now, clear as day. The fame, the wealth, the power, all of it had painted a target on his back. He had built a kingdom in a world where kings never die of old age. Harlem had reminded him of its oldest rule, you can't outsmart the inevitable. And yet, beneath the pain, there was gratitude. He was alive. Barely, but alive. The bullets hadn't ended his story, they had rewritten it. From that hospital bed, Azie Faison began to understand something he had never truly seen before, that the real battle wasn't for survival in the streets, but for survival of the soul. Money couldn't protect you. Respect couldn't heal you. And loyalty, the rarest currency of all, could vanish with a whisper. The empire he built was gone now, scattered like dust in the wind. But something else was beginning, something quieter, deeper. That night of blood and betrayal would mark the end of Azie the hustler, and the beginning of Azie the man. The first sound he remembered clearly was the steady beeping of a machine, rhythmic, patient, almost human. It was the sound of survival. When Azie Faison opened his eyes, the world was blurred and sterile. White walls. Fluorescent lights. The faint scent of antiseptic and latex. Somewhere nearby, a nurse whispered instructions, her voice calm but distant, like a dream fading before it's understood. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the pain returned, sharp and undeniable, like an old debt come due. His body felt foreign. He tried to move, but nothing responded. His chest burned with every breath, his arms felt heavy, bound by tape and tubing. The room around him was quiet except for the hum of machines keeping time with his heartbeat. He was alive, barely, but alive nonetheless. They told him later that he'd been shot 9 times. 9 bullets. Each one with a chance to end him. The doctors called it a miracle. But Azie didn't feel like a miracle. He felt hollow. Somewhere between the drugs and the trauma, he realized something irreversible: he had been spared, but not saved. His mother was the first face he truly saw when the haze lifted. She was sitting beside his bed, her hands clasped, her eyes red but proud. She didn't speak at first. She just looked at him, her son, the boy she'd once carried through fire, now lying broken again, this time from a different kind of flame. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "You still here, baby?" she whispered. "You still here?" He tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded slowly, tears welling behind his eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about money, or territory, or power. He was thinking about breathing, about the fragile, simple act of staying alive. Days turned into nights, and nights into a slow recovery. Each movement was agony. Each breath, a negotiation. Nurses came and went, doctors checked monitors, visitors whispered condolences disguised as congratulations. Everyone wanted to see the man who survived 9 bullets. Some came out of love, others out of curiosity. In Harlem, stories spread fast, but legends spread faster. Outside, the city buzzed with rumors. Azie got hit but he ain't dead. They said he stood up and walked out the hospital. He must have had angels watching. The streets turned his survival into myth. But inside that hospital room, there were no angels, only pain, reflection, and a dawning truth. Lying there, immobilized, Azie had nothing to distract him from himself. The ceiling became his confessional. The machines were his metronome. Every beep felt like a reminder: you're still here, but why? He replayed the night over and over in his mind. The sound of the door crashing open. The voices. The flashes. The weight of betrayal. He knew. Deep down, that the men who did it weren't strangers. They had eaten at his table, laughed with him, maybe even called him brother. That realization cut deeper than any bullet could. For the first time in years, Azie prayed. Not for revenge, not for riches, for clarity. He wanted to understand what all of this had been for. What was the point of building an empire if it could vanish in seconds? What was the value of loyalty if it broke the moment you turned your back? The questions circled his mind like restless ghosts. The days grew quieter as his body began to heal. The nurses learned his rhythm, the way he stared out the window during sunrise, the way he'd flinch at sudden noises. He wasn't the same man who had ruled Harlem's corners. That version of Azie had died on that apartment floor. What remained was someone older, heavier with truth, and strangely peaceful. Visitors came less frequently as the novelty of his survival faded. The streets moved on, as they always did. But Rich Porter visited often, sitting beside him for hours, talking softly about the world outside, who was saying what, how business was shifting, how everyone was waiting for Azie's return. But Azie didn't respond much. He listened, nodded, and stared at the window. "I don't think I'm going back," he said once, voice barely above a whisper. Rich looked at him, surprised. "You serious?" Azie just nodded again. "The game tried to bury me," he said. "I think it's time I stopped digging my own grave too." The doctors said he was lucky. The bullets had missed vital arteries by fractions of inches. They showed him the X-rays, the metal still inside him, fragments too dangerous to remove. He carried those pieces like medals of war, reminders of what survival truly costs. Outside, winter crept into Harlem. The streets grew colder, harder. The same blocks that once carried laughter now carried sirens. Word spread that Azie was done, that he wasn't coming back to the game. Some refused to believe it. Others waited to see if he'd relapse. In the world he came from, nobody ever really left. They either got rich, got locked, or got buried. Walking away alive was almost unheard of. But Azie meant it. The pain in his body wasn't temporary, it was truth carved into flesh. Every time he tried to sit up, he felt it. Every scar whispered the same lesson: the streets don't pay pensions. The nights in the hospital were the hardest. That's when the memories came. Faces of friends who were gone, moments of laughter now stained with hindsight. He saw the young version of himself, ambitious, sharp, unstoppable, and realized how fragile that arrogance had been. He had spent years mastering a game that could never be won. And yet, beneath the sorrow, there was a strange calm. He had survived the impossible. And with that survival came perspective. The things that had once defined him, money, fear, reputation, now felt small compared to the miracle of waking up. As weeks passed, he began to walk again, slowly, painfully. Each step was a reminder of both his strength and his fragility. The nurses cheered him on, but he barely smiled. He wasn't walking toward a return. He was walking toward an exit. When the doctors finally released him, the cold Harlem air hit his face like rebirth. The city was the same, noisy, alive, dangerous, but he was not. He looked around and saw it differently now. Every corner was a memory, every shadow a warning. The empire he'd built no longer called to him. He went home, not to rebuild, but to rest. He didn't answer the phone, didn't meet with his crew, didn't chase rumors. He sat in silence and let the noise pass him by. Years later, when asked about that time, he said, "That hospital was my awakening. I went in a dealer. I came out a man who finally understood what the streets really cost." And for the first time in a long time, Azie Faison, survivor, legend, sinner, and son, began to breathe again, not as a king of Harlem, but simply as a man who'd been given another chance to live. When Azie Faison returned home from the hospital, Harlem looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. The city's pulse, once exciting, vibrant, full of rhythm, now sounded distant, hollow. Every corner, every building carried ghosts. The same streets that had once celebrated his name now whispered it differently, softer, like a memory half buried in regret. He had survived, but something inside him hadn't. People called it a miracle that he was still alive. They came to visit him, some out of love, others out of curiosity. "Man, you're blessed," they'd say. "You beat death." But Azie didn't feel blessed. He felt like a ghost walking through the ruins of a life he no longer recognized. The empire was gone, the trust was gone, and with it went his sense of purpose. For weeks, he stayed inside, curtains drawn, letting the world spin without him. He'd wake to the sound of the city outside, cars passing, children shouting, music echoing faintly through alleyways, and he'd feel both near and far from it all. The bullet wounds were healing, but the deeper wounds, the ones you couldn't see, were only beginning to form. He found himself haunted by memories. Faces he once trusted. Nights filled with laughter that now felt like betrayal in disguise. He could still hear the echoes of that night, the shattering door, the gunfire, the silence afterward. The mind has its own way of replaying pain, looping it until the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Azie began to move carefully again, but not for survival this time, for sanity. He'd walk slowly through the apartment, tracing the light as it moved across the walls. Sometimes he'd sit at the edge of his bed, staring at his reflection in the window. The man staring back wasn't the same person who had ruled Harlem's corners. His eyes were older, quieter, filled with something that looked like mourning. He avoided the streets as much as he could. When he did step outside, people treated him like an urban legend come to life. Strangers would stop him just to touch his hand, to say they'd met him. Some spoke with admiration, "You're the one who lived." Others spoke with warning, "Be careful, Azie. They're still talking." He didn't answer. What was there to say? The truth was that he no longer belonged to the streets, but the streets still belonged to him. No one ever really escapes their past, it lingers, watching, waiting. Days bled into nights. He began to read again, newspapers, biographies, anything that took him away from Harlem, even for a few pages. He listened to old records his mother used to play, Marvin Gaye, Donny Hathaway, Al Green. The lyrics hit differently now. They weren't just songs about love or loss, they were about yearning for peace. The phone rang often, but Azie ignored it. Sometimes Rich Porter called, leaving messages full of optimism. "You good, bro? We can bounce back. You know we always do." But Azie didn't want to bounce back. He wanted stillness. He wanted to find out what existed beyond the endless cycle of gain and loss. He started visiting his mother more. Her apartment was smaller, simpler, but it felt real. She cooked for him, even when he wasn't hungry, and she talked to him like he was still her boy, not the man Harlem had made him. "You been through fire twice," she'd tell him. "The first time God showed you how to run. The second time, He showed you how to stop." Those words stayed with him. There were nights when Azie would sit alone and think about all the people he'd lost. Faces from the past drifted through his memory, friends killed in crossfire, others locked away for life. Some had betrayed him, some had saved him, and many had simply vanished. Harlem didn't keep archives of the fallen, it buried them in whispers. He couldn't shake the guilt. He'd look out the window and see the same blocks where kids now played next to addicts, children growing up in the shadow of the empire he helped create. He didn't sell poison anymore, but he could still see it working, spreading, destroying. In that realization came the hardest truth of all, that survival meant accountability. He was alive, which meant he had to live with what he'd done. For a long time, Azie thought redemption wasn't possible. The streets didn't believe in second chances, they only believed in repetition. But something inside him was changing, a small, steady voice whispering that maybe the same mind that once organized destruction could now be used to build something better. He didn't know what that looked like yet. He only knew he was done with the game. Still, walking away wasn't easy. Temptation lingered like perfume, old connections offering new deals, promises of fast cash. Some tried to lure him back with nostalgia. "It ain't the same without you," they'd say. But Azie had already seen the truth beneath the glamour. The same streets that once crowned him had tried to bury him. He wouldn't bow to them again. He kept his distance, staying home most nights, listening to the hum of the city like a lullaby. There was sadness in it, but also relief. For the first time in years, no one was calling for him, no one was expecting him to lead. The weight of the empire had lifted. In its place was a silence that felt both strange and sacred. One evening, as the sun set over Harlem, painting the buildings in orange and gold, Azie stood by the window and whispered to himself, "I made it out." The words didn't sound triumphant. They sounded fragile, like a prayer for the fallen. Because deep down, he knew the truth, no one really makes it out of the streets untouched. You either die in them, live haunted by them, or spend your life trying to make peace with them. Azie was choosing the third path. He began to write notes, fragments of thoughts, lessons, confessions. He didn't know what he'd do with them yet, but writing felt like healing. Each line was a quiet act of reclamation, a way to take ownership of his story before someone else told it wrong. The city outside was still chaotic, but inside his small apartment, time moved differently now. Slower. Gentler. He found comfort in simple things, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain on the window, the occasional laughter of children downstairs. Life, stripped of glamour, had texture again. And though the ghosts of his past still lingered, they no longer frightened him. They reminded him. They kept him honest. Harlem hadn't changed, but Azie had. The king of the streets had become its quiet observer, watching from the sidelines, no longer seeking power, but peace. He was no longer running the game. He was finally learning how to live beyond it. Time passed, but Harlem didn't rest. The city kept moving, fast and merciless, swallowing one generation after another. For Azie Faison, healing was a quiet, lonely process. He spent his days avoiding old corners, old faces, old temptations. But even distance couldn't stop the echoes of the past from finding him. Harlem had a way of calling you back, not through words, but through the weight of unfinished stories. And Azie's story wasn't finished. Rich Porter was still out there, still shining, still loved by the streets. He had become Harlem's golden boy, charming, disciplined, loyal. Where Azie had retreated, Rich had stepped forward. Together, they had once dreamed of building something that lasted. But now, Azie was done with the game, and Rich was still in it. Their paths, once identical, were beginning to diverge. At first, Azie didn't worry. Rich had always been careful. He wasn't reckless like Alpo, he moved with intelligence, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But the game doesn't reward caution, it punishes it. And soon, Azie began to notice small shifts, tension in conversations, rumors whispered in passing. Harlem's underworld was shifting again, and peace, as always, was temporary. The bond between Azie, Rich, and Alpo, once unbreakable, was beginning to fracture. It wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow erosion, like water wearing down stone. Success had changed them all in different ways. Azie had withdrawn, tired of the endless cycle of greed and betrayal. Rich was still loyal to the dream, still believing they could rise above the violence. And Alpo was restless. Alpo had always been the wild one, fearless, charming, dangerous. But after Azie stepped back, something inside him shifted. Without that quiet stability guiding him, his impulses grew louder. He wanted more money, more recognition, more control. The streets were feeding him, and he was feeding the streets. He started making moves on his own, expanding into other boroughs, building connections that blurred the lines between loyalty and self-interest. Azie could see what was happening, even from a distance. He'd hear stories, Alpo flashing money, showing off new cars, moving product faster than anyone thought possible. But behind the flash was recklessness. And recklessness, in Harlem, was a countdown. One evening, Rich came to visit Azie. He looked tired, not physically, but spiritually. They sat quietly in Azie's apartment, the television playing in the background, more for noise than for comfort. Finally, Rich spoke. "I don't know what's going on with Alpo," he said. "He's changing, man. He's not the same." Azie nodded, saying nothing at first. He'd seen this before, power turning partners into strangers. "He's young," Azie finally said. "He still thinks the game loves him." Rich sighed, rubbing his temples. "He's talking crazy, bro, talking about taking over, about not needing anybody. I'm trying to keep him close, but," his voice trailed off. Azie leaned back in his chair. You can't save someone who don't think he needs saving. The room fell silent. Both men understood what wasn't being said. In the streets, love and loyalty had expiration dates. Over the next few months, tension grew thicker. Whispers turned into confrontations. People began taking sides, some loyal to Rich, others drawn to Alpo's boldness. Azie stayed out of it, but he could feel the tremors coming. The empire they once built together was cracking at its foundation. There were arguments, small at first, then louder. Money. Territory. Respect. Things that once seemed trivial now became reasons for mistrust. Harlem had seen this story before, brothers turning on brothers, loyalty poisoned by pride. But this time, it felt personal. The Harlem trio had once symbolized unity. Now, they symbolized the inevitable fall that comes with ambition unchecked. Azie didn't pick up the phone much anymore. He knew that any word, any visit, could pull him back into a world he no longer wanted. But when Rich called, he always answered. There was history between them, a bond forged in fire and struggle. "You good?" Azie would ask. "I'm good," Rich would reply. But they both knew those words didn't mean what they used to. By late 1989, the streets were changing again. Harlem was louder, angrier. The drug wars were at their peak. Violence wasn't rare anymore, it was routine. Every day brought new funerals, new rumors, new betrayals. The quiet discipline Azie had once enforced was gone. The new generation didn't care about codes or structure. They wanted everything, fast, flashy, and now. And Alpo was thriving in that chaos. His name was everywhere, whispered in admiration, shouted in fear. He had become the new face of Harlem's underworld, and with that came ego. He began to see himself not as part of something, but as the thing. Rich noticed it too. The brotherhood that once felt sacred was turning into competition. Azie, watching from afar, could only shake his head. He saw the end before anyone else did. He'd been there. He knew how it ended for men who couldn't see past power. But warnings fall on deaf ears when success is loud. Then came the first real fracture, something small, but symbolic. Alpo made a move without telling Rich, cutting into territory they'd once agreed to leave alone. Rich confronted him. The conversation, which began as business, ended with resentment. Trust cracked. From there, everything unraveled quickly. Rumors began to spread that Alpo was working with people outside Harlem. Deals were happening behind closed doors. Money was missing. Loyalty, once their foundation, was now a rumor. Azie didn't need to hear every detail, he could feel it. The streets have a language of their own, and when things start turning, you can taste it in the air. The trio that had once represented brotherhood and brilliance was now a ticking clock. Azie knew what was coming next. Harlem always repeated its lessons. The game never let friendship survive its hunger. One night, unable to sleep, Azie sat by his window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Rich and Alpo were still trying to coexist in a world that didn't allow peace for long. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "Please let them make it out." But deep down, he already knew how this story would end. Harlem had a way of writing its own endings, and they were never gentle. Soon, a tragedy would strike that would break the city's heart and confirm what Azie had come to understand long ago. In the game, love and loyalty are the first things to die. There are moments in every story where silence feels louder than any gunshot. For Harlem, that silence came the day Rich Porter died. It was the winter of 1990. The air was sharp, cold enough to turn every breath into fog. The streets were gray and restless, heavy with rumors. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to believe it. Harlem had lost people before, too many to count, but this felt different. This felt personal. Rich Porter wasn't just another name in the game. He was Harlem's pride, smooth, charismatic, always smiling, always giving back. He'd risen from the same poverty as everyone else but carried himself with a grace that made people believe in possibilities. He wasn't just respected, he was loved. So when word spread that he'd gone missing, the whole neighborhood held its breath. Azie Faison heard the news through a whisper, a phone call that froze him in place. "Rich ain't been seen since yesterday," the voice said. The words felt unreal, like a dream slipping into nightmare. Azie's mind flooded with memories, late-night drives, shared meals, plans for a better future. The thought of Rich being in danger didn't fit the story they'd lived together. But the streets don't care about stories. They rewrite them every day. For days, Harlem buzzed with confusion. Flyers went up. People whispered theories. Some said it was a rival crew, others claimed it was police business gone wrong. But the truth, the awful, unthinkable truth, was darker than anyone could imagine. Rich had been kidnapped. At first, no one believed it. Kidnappings weren't part of Harlem's usual script. But soon, a call came, a ransom demand. The voice on the line asked for money, a lot of it, promising Rich's safe return. For a brief moment, there was hope. Azie wanted to help, but the situation was tangled in fear and mistrust. Every move had to be careful. The streets were watching. Then came the second call, colder, quieter. There would be no reunion. When they found Rich, it wasn't in a hospital or a holding spot. It was on the side of a Bronx highway. The news spread like wildfire, disbelief turning into grief, grief into rage. Harlem went silent that day, the kind of silence that carries weight, like morning carved into air. People cried openly in the streets. Shops closed. Radios played slow songs that sounded like prayer. Azie couldn't move when he heard. It was as if time itself had stopped. His friend, his brother, the man who once symbolized everything good left in their world, was gone, not to prison, not to exile, but to betrayal. It didn't make sense. Rich had never crossed anyone carelessly. He had been loyal to a fault. So why him? The truth came slowly, like poison spreading through veins. The man responsible wasn't a rival or a stranger. It was Alpo. When the news reached Azie, it didn't come with anger at first. It came with disbelief. He refused to believe it, not Alpo. Not the man who had once called Rich his brother. But the evidence was undeniable. In a world built on trust, the ultimate betrayal had come from within. The realization broke something in Azie that had somehow survived all the years of danger. The betrayal didn't just kill Rich, it killed whatever was left of the Harlem Brotherhood they'd built together. The trio that once symbolized loyalty had now become a cautionary tale carved into the city's concrete. In interviews years later, Azie would say softly, "That was the day Harlem lost its soul." He meant it. The aftermath was brutal. Harlem mourned publicly, but privately, everyone changed. Friendships dissolved. Paranoia deepened. No one trusted anyone anymore. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been wounded, a collective trauma that never quite healed. For Azie, the pain was heavier than grief. It was guilt. He couldn't stop thinking about what might have been different if he had stayed in the game, if he had been there to keep peace between his brothers. He replayed conversations in his head, moments he could have spoken up, warnings he could have given. If I'd stayed close, he whispered to himself one night, maybe he'd still be alive. But the truth was larger than him. The streets had already written their ending. The funeral drew crowds like Harlem hadn't seen in years. Cars lined the blocks. People who had once fought stood side by side in mourning. The sound of sobbing mixed with the low hum of engines idling. Azie stood in the back, wearing black, face expressionless but eyes hollow. When the casket passed, he felt his knees weaken. It wasn't just a friend he was burying, it was the last piece of the life he'd once believed in. That night, Harlem felt emptier. Even the air seemed different. The corners were quieter, the laughter gone. People moved faster, talked less. Trust had vanished completely. Azie withdrew further into himself. He didn't go out. He didn't take calls. He sat in the same chair by the window, staring at the city lights and wondering how everything had turned so dark so quickly. The same empire they had built to escape poverty had consumed them all. He thought about Alpo, not with hate, but with sorrow. What could drive a man to kill his brother? Was it greed? Fear? Or just the inevitable curse of the streets? Azie didn't know, but he understood something now: the game had no winners. Only survivors, and even they were haunted. The sound of Harlem at night became unbearable. Every siren, every shout, every car backfiring felt like memory replaying itself. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, expecting a knock on the door that never came. Trauma, he realized, didn't live in the body, it lived in time. In the months that followed, Azie began to drift from Harlem completely. He visited his mother often, spending quiet evenings helping her cook, pretending life was simple again. But even there, in the safety of her small apartment, he carried ghosts. Rich's death became a symbol for Harlem, a turning point. It marked the end of innocence, if innocence had ever truly existed there. The streets were never the same afterward. Every young hustler who came after knew the story, told it like a warning. Don't trust nobody, they'd say. Even your friends can take you out. Years later, when Azie reflected on that time, his voice would always drop when he spoke of Rich. He had a good heart, he'd say softly. He wanted better for all of us. And that's why it hurt so much, because he didn't deserve that ending. The night after Rich's funeral, Azie stood alone on a Harlem rooftop, looking over the city that had given him everything and taken everything back. The wind was cold, the skyline glowing faintly in the distance. He whispered to the darkness, "Rest easy, bro. You were the realest one." And in that moment, quiet, broken, and alone, Azie knew his life in the streets was truly over. There would be no going back. There are betrayals that end a friendship, and there are betrayals that echo forever. For Azie Faison, the death of Rich Porter was more than loss, it was the breaking of the world he once believed in. Harlem had always been dangerous, but now it felt poisoned. The code, the loyalty, the silent brotherhood that had once defined the streets, all of it shattered the moment Alpo Martinez pulled that trigger. When Azie first heard that Alpo had confessed, he didn't believe it. He couldn't. The mind rejects certain truths, not because they're unclear, but because they're too painful to hold. But as the details surfaced, one piece after another, disbelief gave way to devastation. It was true. Alpo had killed Rich. The revelation spread through Harlem like wildfire. People didn't whisper it, they shouted it in anger, in disbelief, in heartbreak. The name Alpo went from symbol of fear to synonym for betrayal. The same man who had once been celebrated for his confidence and charisma had crossed the final line. He had taken the life of a brother. Azie didn't go looking for vengeance. He didn't send threats or gather people. He didn't curse Alpo's name on the streets. He simply went quiet. The silence wasn't forgiveness, it was grief. It was the sound of a man realizing that the world he built had collapsed from the inside. He spent days sitting in the same spot by his window, watching Harlem move on without him. The city didn't pause for tragedy, it just adjusted its rhythm. People still hustled, still laughed, still dreamed, but something vital was gone. Harlem's spirit had dimmed. The streets felt heavier now, every conversation wrapped in paranoia. The old Harlem, the one of codes and loyalty, was gone, replaced by something colder. Azie thought often about the irony of it all. He had survived bullets meant to kill him, but it was betrayal that truly broke him. 9 gunshots hadn't finished what one act of disloyalty had. When he thought of Alpo, anger came first, but then something else, pity. He understood what had happened, even if he could never accept it. The streets consumed everyone eventually. They didn't care how smart, loyal, or ambitious you were. The game wasn't about winning, it was about surviving, and even survival came with debt. Alpo had once been the fearless one, the risk-taker, the one who wanted it all. But the higher he climbed, the lonelier he became. When the money stopped satisfying, power became the new drug. And power, Azie knew too well, made men do unspeakable things. In those days, the news of Alpo's actions spread far beyond Harlem. It reached Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, even Chicago. His name became a ghost story, parents warning their kids, hustlers whispering at night, "Don't be like Alpo." But Azie didn't need warnings. He had seen enough to understand the deeper truth, that betrayal doesn't just kill relationships, it kills faith. He tried to stay out of conversations, but Harlem wouldn't let him. People came to him for answers. "You knew him best," they'd say. How could he do that? Azie never had a satisfying answer. "The streets," he'd reply softly. "They change people. They make monsters out of men who were once good." The confession came later, not to Azie, but to the police. In an act that shocked even the coldest corners of the city, Alpo turned informant. He cooperated with authorities to save himself from a lifetime behind bars. Harlem didn't just call him a murderer now, they called him a rat. The double betrayal sealed his fate. His name was no longer spoken with fear or fame, but with disgust. For Azie, this final revelation wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation of everything he'd already learned, that the streets had no loyalty, and those who built their lives on it would always be betrayed by it. Still, knowing the truth didn't make it easier. Every time he thought of Rich's laughter, of the early days when the three of them dreamed together, his chest tightened. Those memories, once warm, now carried the cold sting of loss. He began having dreams about them, surreal, haunting dreams where the three of them were back in their youth, walking through Harlem at night, laughing like nothing could touch them. Then the laughter would fade, and he'd wake up to the silence of his room, drenched in sweat, staring at the same city that had given him everything and taken it all back. Azie didn't hate Harlem, he couldn't. It was part of him. But he began to understand that love for the streets was a kind of curse. You could leave the game, but you could never leave its memories. They lived inside you, replaying themselves, reminding you of who you were and what you lost. Years passed. Alpo's story continued, arrests, trials, relocation. He'd left Harlem physically, but he couldn't escape its shadow. His cooperation with the law meant he'd never walk those blocks again without fear. In the end, time caught up with him too. Decades later, he returned briefly to New York, and in the early hours of a cold October morning, he was shot and killed. When Azie heard the news, he didn't celebrate. He didn't even react right away. He sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he said quietly, "The streets don't forget." There was no joy in it, no vindication, only inevitability. Because Harlem, in its own way, always closes the circle. After Alpo's death, people came to Azie again, asking what he thought. He only said, "It's over now." Not because justice had been served, but because the story had finally reached its natural end. Every man involved, himself, Rich, Alpo, had paid the price. Azie sometimes visited the old blocks where they used to stand together. The city had changed. The corners were cleaner, the faces younger. But the ghosts were still there, watching quietly, living in the spaces between memories. Standing there, he would think about how easily greatness turns to tragedy when ambition loses its balance. How love, loyalty, and betrayal can exist inside the same story, not as contradictions, but as inevitabilities. He no longer carried hate. What he carried instead was wisdom, the heavy kind that comes only after loss. He once said in an interview years later, "I don't hate Alpo. I hate what the streets do to people like him. People like us. It was a line that said everything. The Harlem trio, Azie, Rich, and Alpo, had started as brothers bound by dreams. But in the end, they became three symbols of what the streets do best: lift you high enough to believe in immortality, then remind you, brutally, that no one escapes the fall. That was the truth Azie had learned to live with, a truth he would one day teach to others. But for now, he sat alone, listening to the faint hum of the city at night. Somewhere out there, Harlem kept breathing, unaware of the legends buried beneath its pavement. And Azie, the survivor, closed his eyes, not in peace, but in understanding. When Azie Faison finally decided to walk away, it didn't happen in one dramatic moment. There was no final deal, no grand farewell, no speech to the streets. It happened quietly, the way most endings do. One morning, he simply woke up and knew that the life he'd built no longer belonged to him. The game that had once made him feel invincible now felt like a cage with no exit. The decision had been forming for months. Every time he passed a corner where someone had died, every time he saw another young face disappear into the system, the truth pressed harder against his chest. The streets weren't a path to freedom, they were a loop, a cruel cycle that promised everything and took even more. He was tired of surviving. He wanted to live. At first, the idea of leaving felt impossible. The streets didn't offer retirement plans. You didn't just walk away, you either got out in a coffin, or in cuffs. But Azie had survived bullets, betrayal, and grief. He had lived through what should have killed him. And somehow, he felt that survival itself was permission to change. He began to distance himself from everything that tied him to his past, the phone numbers, the contacts, the constant noise of transactions and tension. He stopped answering calls, stopped showing up to the usual spots, stopped being available. Some people noticed. Some didn't. The streets move on fast. For those who did notice, rumors began to spread. Azie's laying low. Azie's done with it. He's out. Nobody believed it at first. Harlem had seen too many men try to leave, only to get pulled back in. But this time was different. He wasn't leaving out of fear, he was leaving out of exhaustion. Freedom wasn't a single act, it was 1,000 small choices made over and over again. Azie made them quietly, refusing a deal here, ignoring a favor there, avoiding the places that once defined him. Every step away felt like learning how to breathe again. Still, walking away meant facing himself. Without the noise of money and danger, the silence grew loud. At night, when the city settled, he'd sit by the window and feel the weight of everything he'd lost. Rich. The empire. The friends who'd vanished. The innocence that had burned out years ago. Harlem glowed beneath him, a place of beauty and pain interwoven like threads in the same fabric. Sometimes he'd whisper to himself, "You made it out," but the words felt uncertain, like he was still trying to convince himself. There were temptations, of course. People still approached him with offers. One more move, they'd say. Just one more. But the thought of going back filled him with something new, not fear, but disgust. The old thrill was gone. The stakes had lost their meaning. He didn't want more money. He wanted peace, a word he had never truly understood until now. He began focusing on the things that once seemed small, waking up to daylight instead of anxiety, making breakfast with his mother, hearing laughter instead of sirens. He started to rediscover what it meant to be human, not a name on the street. The first time he turned down a major deal, he expected consequences. Maybe someone would come after him, maybe the whispers would turn to threats. But nothing happened. The city didn't notice his absence, it just kept moving. That realization was both humbling and liberating. The world didn't revolve around him anymore. It never had. In the months that followed, he started meeting with old friends, not the ones from the game, but people from before. Childhood faces, neighborhood elders, even teachers who still remembered him as that quiet boy who used to dream big. They didn't see a legend or a criminal. They just saw Azie. And for the first time in years, that was enough. He didn't speak about his past much. When people brought it up, he'd nod politely and change the subject. It wasn't shame that silenced him, it was weariness. The story had already taken too much from him. Retelling it would only reopen old wounds. But inside, something new was growing, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. He realized that survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of responsibility. If he had been given another chance at life, maybe it wasn't just for him. Maybe he could do something with it. That thought became his quiet motivation. He didn't know what shape it would take yet, advocacy, education, storytelling, but he knew it would be built on honesty. Harlem didn't need another myth, it needed truth. He began writing again, fragments of memory, reflections, lessons. He wrote about the thrill of the rise and the horror of the fall. About the illusion of control, and how easy it was to confuse fear with respect. He wrote about how every dollar came with a shadow, and how every choice in the streets carried invisible interest that you'd eventually pay. The words weren't for fame or redemption. They were therapy. Azie wasn't trying to convince anyone he was a saint. He was just trying to understand the man he'd become. One afternoon, while sitting in a small cafe uptown, an older man approached him. "You're Azie, right?" the man said softly. Azie nodded, cautious. "You don't know me," the man continued, "but I lost my brother to that era. He looked up to you." Azie lowered his eyes, not out of guilt, but out of understanding. The man didn't blame him. He just wanted to say that hearing Azie speak about leaving the streets had helped him make peace with his own loss. "You survived," the man said, "so you could tell the truth." Then he walked away, leaving Azie with a feeling he hadn't known in years, purpose. That night, back in his apartment, Azie stood by the window again, looking down at Harlem's lights. The same city that once defined his pain now looked softer, almost forgiving. He exhaled deeply and whispered, "I'm done." It wasn't a vow of escape, it was a declaration of freedom. Because walking away wasn't about running from danger, it was about running toward life. He had been a hustler, a leader, a survivor. But now, he was something rarer, a man who had seen the edge of destruction and chosen not to fall. In time, he would turn his pain into purpose. He would find ways to reach others, to share what he had learned the hard way. But that came later. For now, in this moment, Azie Faison simply stood alone, breathing in the cold Harlem air, the air of survival, of forgiveness, of rebirth. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel trapped by his past. He felt free. Change doesn't come all at once. It seeps in quietly, like light finding its way through a cracked window. For Azie Faison, transformation began not with speeches or grand plans, but with simple realization. Survival meant more than staying alive. It meant doing something with the life that had been spared. The man who had once built one of Harlem's most sophisticated drug empires now woke up early, made coffee, and read in silence. He had traded the hum of the streets for the hum of thought. Where once his mind calculated profits and risks, it now wrestled with questions, about morality, about purpose, about how to turn pain into meaning. The world outside hadn't changed much. Harlem was still Harlem, beautiful, bruised, alive. But Azie's view of it had shifted completely. He no longer saw opportunity in the hustle. He saw stories, human, fragile, tragic. Each face on the block told a version of the same tale he already knew, the chase, the fall, the regret. It was like watching a younger version of himself in pieces scattered across the city. He started to speak quietly, first to himself, then to others. At local schools and community centers, he began telling his story, not for attention, but for prevention. He spoke softly, without dramatics, as if narrating a dream. "I was you," he'd say to the teenagers staring back at him. "I wanted the clothes, the cars, the respect. I thought I was building something real. But what I built was a cage." The room would always fall silent when he spoke. There was power in his calm, the kind that comes from surviving something you can't fully explain. He didn't glorify the past. He didn't hide it either. He told it straight, the good, the bad, the unforgivable. At first, he was nervous. Who was he to teach anyone anything? He wasn't a preacher or a professor. But the faces he saw, those restless, hungry eyes, reminded him of his younger self. He saw the same dreams, the same hunger for more. And he knew exactly where those dreams could lead if left unchecked. Each time he spoke, a weight lifted. He wasn't erasing the past, he was reclaiming it. Every story told was another step toward healing, another reminder that survival wasn't meaningless. The same discipline that once built an empire was now building purpose. He began visiting prisons too, talking to young men who still believed the streets were the only way to be seen. Some listened, some didn't, but he kept going. "If I can get through to one," he'd tell himself, then the pain meant something. What surprised him most was how people responded, not with judgment, but gratitude. Some of those who once feared or idolized him now respected him for different reasons. They saw in him what they rarely saw in men who came from their world, growth. Still, the work wasn't easy. Every time he stood in front of a crowd and told his story, it was like reopening a wound. Talking about Rich Porter, about betrayal, about being shot 9 times, it brought back ghosts.